You laughed at the janitor this morning. So why is she sitting in the CEO chair tonight? The sound of quiet laughter echoed across the glass-walled conference room as polished shoes stepped carelessly over a freshly cleaned floor. Olivia Bennett kept her head down, her hands steady on the mop, even as a group of executives walked past her like she did not exist. One of them smirked, dragging his shoe across the wet surface just to leave a mark. Another woman, sharp voice and colder eyes, glanced at Olivia and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe if you cleaned faster, you would not still be here at this age." A ripple of amusement followed. Olivia did not respond. She simply moved the mop again, erasing the mark without a word. Her silence was not weakness. It was patience. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Olivia pushed her cart down the long hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights above her mixing with distant conversations about profit margins and executive bonuses. No one noticed how her eyes lingered on the screens, displaying financial reports. No one questioned how she paused for just a second outside the boardroom door, listening, memorizing voices, patterns, mistakes. To them, she was invisible, just another janitor in a company too large to care. But invisibility can be powerful when no one is looking closely. As she reached the end of the corridor, a man in a wrinkled shirt stepped aside to let her pass. He offered a small nod, a simple gesture of respect that seemed almost out of place in a building full of ego. Olivia met his eyes for a brief moment and returned the nod. That moment passed quickly, swallowed by the noise of the corporate machine, but stayed with her. Because kindness, no matter how small, always leaves a trace. She entered the executive lounge quietly, her cartwheels barely making a sound against the polished floor. On the large table lay scattered documents, charts, projections. She did not touch them. She did not need to. One glance was enough. Numbers aligned in her mind like a language she had spoken her entire life. A faint smile touched her lips, gone before anyone could notice. Behind the walls of power, beneath layers of arrogance and control, something was very wrong. And Olivia Bennett had already seen it all. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in her ears, but it no longer carried weight. Because by the end of this day, the same voices that mocked her would fall silent. And when they did, they would finally understand one simple truth. The janitor they ignored had been watching them all along. Olivia Bennett moved through the building like a shadow that no one bothered to follow, her cart rolling quietly beside her as conversations about quarterly targets and executive bonuses echoed through the halls. And yet behind her calm expression her mind was anything but still, because every word she overheard, every careless comment, every number casually mentioned was being stored and analyzed with precision. She paused briefly outside another conference room where voices rose in frustration. And arrogance, a man inside complained about missing funds while another dismissed it as a minor reporting delay. Olivia lowered her gaze, but her ears sharpened because that was not a delay, that was a pattern. She had seen it already hidden in fragments across different departments like pieces of a puzzle no one thought to connect. She resumed walking and turned into a quiet corridor where the noise faded into a distant hum. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting long pale reflections across the polished floor. She stopped beside a supply closet and reached into her pocket, pulling out her employee badge. The plastic surface slightly scratched with a label "temporary janitor" printed beneath her name. She stared at it for a moment, not with frustration, but with quiet calculation, as if the identity itself was part of something much larger, a disguise that had served its purpose. Footsteps approached, and she slipped the badge back into her pocket, just as Ethan Cole appeared carrying a small toolkit. He looked surprised to see her there, but not annoyed, not dismissive. Instead, he gave a small, tired smile and nodded toward the vacuum cleaner beside her. "That thing sounds like it is about to give up on life," he said in a low voice. Olivia glanced at the machine, then back at him, and for a second her expression softened. "It has been through a lot," she replied calmly. Ethan crouched down without hesitation and began adjusting a loose panel. His movements careful and unassuming, Most people here would have walked past without even noticing, but he stayed focused as if fixing something small still mattered. After a moment, the machine hummed back to life, smoother, quieter. He stood and wiped his hands on his shirt. "There you go, should last a little longer." Olivia met his eyes again, this time holding the look just a fraction longer than before. "Thank you," she said simply. Ethan shrugged, as if it was nothing, but there was a sincerity in his expression that lingered even after he walked away. Olivia watched him disappear down the hall, then turned back to her work. But something had shifted, because kindness, however small, always stood out in a place where power often replaced humanity. She pushed her cart toward the executive floor where access was restricted to most staff, but as she approached the secured door, she reached in her pocket again, not for the janitor badge, but for something else. A sleek key card with no label, no color. Markings just a thin strip of black that reflected the overhead light. She held it between her fingers for a brief second before sliding it through the reader. The door clicked open instantly, without hesitation, without question. Olivia stepped inside, moving with the same quiet presence she always carried, but this space was different, larger, quieter, filled with offices that overlooked the city skyline. She entered one empty office and glanced at the massive screen, still displaying financial summaries from the previous meeting. Her eyes moved quickly across the numbers, not reading every detail, but recognizing patterns, inconsistencies, transfers that should not have existed. Her reflection, faintly visible in the glass, showed a woman in a janitor uniform, but her gaze carried something far more controlled, far more aware. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the edge of the desk, as if grounding herself in the moment. This company was bleeding from the inside, and the people responsible were sitting comfortably in boardrooms laughing at things they did not understand. Olivia straightened slowly, then turned away from the screen, her expression returning to neutral, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just confirmed what she already suspected. Somewhere down the hall, a group of executives laughed again, the sound sharp and careless, echoing through the polished corridors. Olivia resumed walking her cart, moving steadily beside her, but now every step carried a quiet certainty, because the game they believed they were controlling had already begun to shift, and they did not even realize it yet. The next morning arrived with a sharper edge in the air, as tension quietly built beneath the surface of the company. Olivia Bennett moved through the lobby, pushing her cart, as usual, but the atmosphere felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was beginning to press down on everyone inside the building. Employees walked faster, voices were lower, and the usual confidence among the executives had shifted into irritation. Inside the main conference room, a large screen displayed numbers that refused to align, and frustration grew louder by the minute. Richard Vaughn stood at the head of the table, his voice controlled, but cold, as he questioned department heads about discrepancies no one could fully explain. Excuses overlapped, incomplete answers filled the room, and irritation turned into blame. Olivia entered quietly, her presence unnoticed, as she began wiping the edges of the glass table. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were simply doing her job, but her eyes observed everything. Every reaction, every hesitation, every glance exchanged between those who knew more than they were willing to say. The tension snapped when one executive slammed his hand against the table and demanded to know who had access to restricted financial systems. The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Richard turned, slightly scanning the room before his gaze shifted toward Olivia. And just like that, the focus changed direction. "Well, there is someone who seems to be everywhere these days," he said with a faint smirk. The room followed his gaze, and suddenly Olivia was no longer invisible. Victoria Hayes leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she looked Olivia up and down with open disdain. "It is always the ones no one notices who end up causing problems," she said, her tone smooth. But cutting, Olivia paused her cleaning for a fraction of a second before continuing, as if the words had not reached her. But the room had already decided. Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes stopping just inches from the wet floor Olivia had just cleaned. "Do you have access to any systems you should not?" he asked, not because he believed it, but because he needed someone to blame. A few executives chuckled quietly, the absurdity of the accusation making it easier to accept. Olivia straightened slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in the room, her expression calm, unreadable. No, she answered, simply, her voice steady without hesitation. The simplicity of her response only seemed to irritate Victoria further. Of course you would say that, she replied sharply before turning to the others. This is exactly the kind of oversight that leads to security risks, letting temporary staff roam wherever they want. The word temporary hung in the air like a label meant to define her worth. Richard exhaled slowly, then nodded, as if a decision had already been made. Effective immediately, all janitorial staff will be restricted to assigned floors only, he announced without looking at Olivia again. And you, he added, glancing back at her, make sure you stay where you belong. A ripple of approval moved through the room, as if order had been restored simply by placing blame on someone weaker. Olivia lowered her gaze once more and resumed wiping the table. Her movements controlled, her breathing even. But beneath that stillness, something shifted, not anger, not humiliation, but confirmation, because in their need to protect themselves, they had revealed more than they realized. She turned slightly, reaching for her cart as the meeting continued without her. And as she moved toward the door, Victoria spoke again, louder this time for everyone to hear. Next time, try not to slow down people who actually matter. Laughter followed, quick, sharp, careless. Olivia paused at the doorway, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the handle. She did not turn back, she did not respond. She simply stood there long enough to let the sound settle in her memory. Then she stepped out into the hallway, and the door closed behind her, cutting off the noise instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the laughter itself. Olivia walked slowly down the corridor, her reflection moving alongside her in the glass walls, but her posture remained unchanged, steady, composed, as if nothing had happened. Yet her eyes were different now, clearer, more certain. They had crossed a line they did not even know existed, and in doing so they had given her exactly what she needed. Not a reason, not a reaction, but proof, and proof was something she would not ignore. The hallway felt quieter after the door closed behind Olivia Bennett, but the silence was not empty. It was full of everything she had just witnessed, every word, every accusation, every careless laugh replaying with clarity as she pushed her cart forward at the same steady pace. Her expression remained unchanged, yet her mind was moving faster than anyone inside that boardroom could ever imagine. She turned into a service corridor where the polished floors gave way to plain concrete, and the hum of corporate voices faded into distant echoes. This was where people like her were meant to exist, out of sight, out of importance. But Olivia did not belong to this space. She only occupied it. She stopped near a maintenance station and rested her hands lightly on the edge of her cart, her fingers still for a moment, as if grounding herself. Then slowly she reached in her pocket and pulled out a small, thin device no larger than a phone. The screen lit up instantly, revealing a secured interface filled with data streams and internal reports that mirrored the very systems the executives believed were protected. Her eyes scanned the information, quickly, not searching, but confirming, because what had just happened in that room aligned perfectly with what she had already uncovered. Unauthorized transfers hidden under layered approvals, accounts adjusted just enough to avoid immediate detection patterns that repeated across departments like a quiet leak spreading through the structure of the company. She tapped the screen once, and a series of highlighted entries appeared, all linked to the same chain of authorization. Richard Vaughn. The name sat there without emotion, but carried weight. Olivia did not react outwardly. She simply observed, as if she had expected it all along. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and she slipped the device back in her pocket, just as Ethan Cole appeared again, this time holding 2 cups of coffee. He slowed when he saw her, noticing the stillness in her posture. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, as if he already sensed the answer might not be simple. Olivia looked at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Just a long morning," she replied, her tone calm, controlled. Ethan hesitated, then extended one of the cups toward her. "I figured you might need this," he said, offering a small half-smile. Olivia accepted the cup, her fingers brushing lightly against his for a brief second. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was something warmer in her voice, not enough to draw attention, but enough to be real. Ethan leaned against the wall beside her, taking a sip from his own cup. "They're all on edge today," he added, glancing down the hallway toward the executive wing. "Something is off." Olivia followed his gaze for a moment, then looked back at him. You notice that she asked quietly, Ethan. Gave a short nod. You do not need to be in those meetings to feel it, he said. People only act like that when they're hiding something or when they are afraid. Olivia held his words for a second, letting them settle, because they echoed her own thoughts. Sometimes it is both, she replied softly. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Yeah, that sounds about right. They stood there in a brief moment of stillness, the kind that rarely existed in a place driven by constant urgency. Then Ethan straightened, pushing himself off the wall. Well, if you need anything, just let me know, he said before stepping back into the flow of the building, disappearing once again into the system that barely noticed him. Olivia watched him go, then turned her attention back to the corridor ahead, the coffee cup still warm in her hand, grounding her in the present. Kindness, however, small, always created a contrast that could not be ignored, especially in a place where power often erased it. She set the cup carefully on her cart and began moving again, her steps steady, her movements precise. But now there was no uncertainty left, only direction. As she reached the end of the corridor, she paused near a window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out under a pale gray sky. Her reflection in the glass showed the same uniform, the same quiet presence, yet behind her eyes something had shifted completely. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were connected, and the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure she could see clearly. Olivia Bennett exhaled slowly, then turned away from the window. By the time the next meeting began, everything would already be in motion, and the people who believed they were in control would soon realize they had been standing on unstable ground all along. By late afternoon, the energy inside the building had shifted from tension to anticipation. Whispers moved faster than emails, and every department seemed to be preparing for something none of them fully understood. Olivia Bennett continued her routine without interruption, her cart rolling steadily across the marble floors as if nothing had changed. But behind the calm rhythm of her movements, her awareness sharpened with every passing second. She passed clusters of employees speaking in low voices about the same topic. The new chief executive officer was arriving tomorrow morning. No one had met her, yet no one knew what to expect, and uncertainty had begun to replace confidence among those who once controlled every room they entered. Olivia stepped into a quiet lounge area and began wiping down a table near a large digital screen that displayed internal announcements. Her eyes lifted briefly as the message rotated, again confirming the scheduled executive meeting where the new leadership would be formally introduced. The room reflected a future none of them were ready for, a future Olivia had already stepped in long before this moment. Behind her, two senior managers spoke in hushed tones. Do you think the board knows what is really going on? One asked. The other shook his head quickly. If they did, there would already be consequences. Olivia listened without reacting, her hands moving in smooth practice, arms, her expression sharp. That works when there is nothing to expose, she replied quietly. This situation is different, and you know it. Richard did not answer immediately, but the silence between them carried more truth than any words could. Olivia stood just beyond the doorway, unnoticed once again, but now she was no longer simply observing, she was confirming final details. The structure of their defense, their assumptions, their weaknesses, everything they believed would protect them was already in place, and that made it easier to dismantle. She stepped away from the doorway before anyone could notice her presence and continued down the hall, her pace unchanged. At the end of the corridor, she stopped briefly near a window where the fading light of the city stretched across the glass. The reflection staring back at her still wore the uniform, still carried the same quiet posture, but there was no hesitation left in her eyes. Tomorrow was no longer an idea, it was a fixed point in time, and everything she had done until now had led directly to it. She reached in her pocket one final time, pulling out the thin device again and unlocking it with a single touch. The screen illuminated with secured files, reports, evidence carefully compiled and organized. Each piece connected, each action traced back to the same source, Richard Vaughn, and those who had chosen to follow him. Olivia held the device, steady, her gaze focused as she reviewed the final sequence of events that would unfold. Access points were confirmed, timing, aligned, communication channel secured. Nothing was left to chance because chance was something she had removed from the equation entirely. She powered the device down and slipped it back in her pocket, then picked up her cart once more as if the moment had never happened. As she moved toward the exit hallway, the building behind her continued to buzz with speculation and uncertainty, but none of them realized that the outcome had already been decided because, while they prepared to meet their new leader, the person they had overlooked, dismissed, and mocked had already taken control of the narrative. And by the time they finally saw her clearly, it would be too late to pretend they had not known exactly how they treated her the night before the announcement settled over the city with a quiet tension that could be felt even inside the empty hallways of the company. Long after most employees had left the building, Olivia Bennett remained, her cart parked silently near the far end of the executive floor, while the lights above cast a soft, steady glow across the polished surfaces. The silence now was different from the daytime noise. It was deeper, more revealing, as if the building itself had finally stopped pretending. Olivia walked slowly through the corridor, no longer rushing, no longer hiding in the rhythm of routine. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as she approached the boardroom one last time before everything changed. The door stood closed but not locked, and she rested her hand lightly against the surface for a brief moment before pushing them open. Inside the room, everything was prepared for the morning. Meeting chairs aligned, documents stacked, screens dark, waiting to come alive. Olivia stepped inside and let the door close behind her, the soft click echoing through the stillness. She walked toward the head of the table, where Richard Vaughn would normally stand, and paused there, her gaze sweeping across the room as if memorizing every detail. Every seat, every reflection of light across the glass walls. This was the stage where power had been performed and abused, where decisions were made without consequence, where people like her had been dismissed without thought. She reached forward and placed her hand on the back of the central chair, the one reserved for the chief executive officer. Her fingers rested there for a second before she slowly pulled the chair back and sat down. The movement was quiet but final, as if the room itself acknowledged the shift. Olivia leaned back slightly, her posture straight, composed, her eyes fixed on the dark screen in front of her. For a moment, there was no past, no insult, no laughter, only clarity. Everything she had endured, every word she had allowed to pass without reaction, had led to this exact point. She reached in her pocket and removed the thin device, placing it gently on the table. With a single touch, the screen in front of her flickered to life, connecting instantly to the system without resistance. Files appeared, organized, precise, evidence layered with undeniable structure. Financial trails, communication records, authorization chains, all leading to the same network of decisions that had nearly hollowed the company from within. Olivia studied the screen not with surprise, but with confirmation. There was fully exposed, no longer hidden behind titles or influence. Richard Vaughn and those who had followed him had built their control on the assumption that no one was watching closely enough. That assumption had been their greatest mistake. Olivia powered the screen down again, returning the room to silence and darkness. She stood slowly, stepping away from the chair, but not before glancing back at it one last time. Tomorrow this seat would no longer belong to the illusion of leadership. It would belong to accountability. She walked toward the door, her reflection moving beside her in the glass walls, still wearing the same uniform, still carrying the same quiet presence. Yet everything about her had changed. As she reached the hallway, she stopped briefly and looked down the long corridor that had once defined her place within the company. A place of invisibility, of dismissal, of quiet endurance. She took a slow breath, then continued walking, leaving the boardroom behind her. As she moved toward the exit, outside the city lights stretched endlessly across the horizon, cars moving like distant signals of life, continuing unaware of what was about to unfold inside this building. Olivia stepped into the elevator alone, the doors closing softly around her reflection. As the elevator began its descent, she stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm, but resolved. Tomorrow there would be no more waiting, no more observing, no more silence. Tomorrow the truth would walk into that room, and it would not ask for permission to be seen. Morning arrived without hesitation, and the building that once felt controlled now carried an undercurrent of unease that no one could fully explain. Employees moved faster, voices were lower, and every glance toward the executive floor carried a quiet curiosity mixed with tension. Olivia Bennett stepped through the main entrance, just as she had every other day, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same cart, yet everything about this morning was different, even if no one could see it yet. She walked past the front desk without drawing attention, her presence still blending into the background of routine operations. But today, invisibility was no longer a necessity, it was a choice she was about to leave behind. Inside, the building executives gathered earlier than usual, their conversations sharp and controlled as they prepared for the arrival of the new chief executive officer. Richard Vaughn stood near the conference room, speaking with urgency to a small group of senior leaders, his tone firm, but edged with something closer to pressure than confidence. "We stay aligned, we stay focused, and we do not let speculation disrupt the message," he said while adjusting his jacket. Victoria Hayes stood beside him, her expression unreadable but her posture tense as she glanced toward the door every few seconds. Something about today did not feel like a routine transition, and she knew it. Olivia continued down the hallway, her cart rolling beside her, until she reached the service corridor, where no one was watching. She stopped there for a moment, her hand resting on the handle as the noise of the building faded behind her. Slowly she looked down at her uniform, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric, as if acknowledging the role it had played. Then, without hesitation, she turned and walked toward a private access door at the end of the corridor. The black keycard slid through the reader, and the door opened instantly, revealing a quiet, restricted space far removed from the daily operations of the company. Olivia stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, cutting off the outside world completely. The room beyond was simple but precise, a space designed for control, not appearance. A wardrobe stood along one wall containing tailored suits, each one measured, exact, structured, intentional. Olivia moved toward it and paused briefly before selecting one. The transformation began without ceremony, without hesitation, as she removed the uniform that had shielded her identity and replaced it with something that reflected the truth she had carried all along. The fabric of the suit settled into place, sharp, clean, commanding. She adjusted the sleeves with calm precision, then stepped toward a mirror mounted on the far wall. Her reflection stared back at her, no longer hidden, no longer diminished, the same eyes, the same composure, but now aligned with the authority she had never lost. Olivia Bennett did not become someone new in that moment. She simply allowed the world to see who she had always been. She reached for a small case resting on the table beside the mirror, opening it to reveal a single identification card, the official recognition of her position. She held it for a second before placing it securely into her pocket. Outside, the building continued to move, unaware that the balance of power had already shifted. Inside the boardroom, executives took their seats one by one, their conversations fading into controlled silence as they waited. Richard stood at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression composed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty he could not fully suppress. The door remained closed, and with every passing second, the anticipation grew heavier. In the hallway, just beyond that door, Olivia walked forward, her steps steady, her pace unhurried, each movement deliberate. There was no rush because this moment belonged to her completely. She reached the entrance and paused for a brief second, her hand resting against the handle. The memory of laughter, of dismissal, of careless words flickered through her mind, not as pain, but as proof. Then, without hesitation, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The door opened with a quiet finality that seemed to pull every sound out of the room at once. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, chairs stilled, and every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance as Olivia Bennett stepped inside. But she was no longer the woman they had ignored in the hallway. The uniform was gone, replaced by a tailored suit that carried authority in every line, every movement. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, but unyielding as she walked forward without hesitation. The sound of her heels against the polished floor echoed softly through the silence, marking each step with precision. Confusion spread across the faces around the table, first as disbelief, then as something sharper, more unsettling. Richard Vaughn froze where he stood, his gaze locked on her, as if trying to force the image to make sense. Victoria Hayes leaned forward, slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Olivia from head to toe, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Olivia did not rush. She did not acknowledge their confusion. Immediately, she simply continued walking until she reached the head of the table, the same position she had stood behind only hours before in silence. She paused there for a brief moment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully into the room. Then she placed a single folder on the table, the sound soft but unmistakable. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the space. "I believe we have been expecting this meeting." The words were simple, but the tone carried something none of them could ignore: authority without announcement. Richard took a step forward, his composure cracking just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice attempting to regain control. "This meeting is for the incoming chief executive officer." Olivia turned her gaze toward him slowly, her expression unchanged. "You are correct," she replied calmly. "And you are looking at her." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. It was not just shock, it was realization beginning to take shape in ways they could not stop. Victoria let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it lacked confidence. "That is not possible," she said sharply. "You have been working here as a janitor." Olivia held her gaze without hesitation. "I have been working here, yes," she answered. The rest was a matter of perspective. A murmur spread across the room as executives exchanged glances, searching for confirmation, searching for denial, but finding neither. Olivia reached into her pocket and removed the identification card, placing it on the table in front of her. The official seal, the board authorization, the confirmation of her position, all visible, undeniable. The shift in the room was immediate, the disbelief collapsing into something far more dangerous: awareness. Richard stared at the card, then back at Olivia, his expression tightening as the truth settled in. "This is some kind of stunt," he said, his voice lower, now more controlled, but no longer confident. Olivia shook her head slightly. "No, this is accountability," she replied. Her tone remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that could not be challenged. She stepped forward, placing her hand lightly on the back of the central chair before taking her seat. The movement was deliberate, final, and as she sat, the power in the room shifted. Completely, no one spoke, no one moved, because in that moment they understood exactly what had happened. Every word they had spoken, every action they had taken, every assumption they had made had been witnessed by the very person they now had to answer to. Olivia looked around the table, meeting each gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her presence undeniable. "You spent days preparing for my arrival," she said quietly, "and yet none of you recognized me when I was already here." The weight of her words settled over them like a truth they could not escape. Outside the room, the building continued to move, as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything had already been rewritten. And for the first time since she had walked through those doors as a janitor, Olivia Bennett was no longer invisible. No one spoke at first, because the weight of Olivia Bennett sitting at the head of the table had already begun to reshape everything they thought they understood. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and in that discomfort the reality settled deeper into each person in the room. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her hands resting calmly on the table, as her gaze moved from one executive to another, not with anger, not with judgment, but with clarity. "You have all been working under the assumption that this company was stable," she began, her voice even measured but impossible to ignore. "That assumption is no longer valid." She reached toward the folder she had placed earlier and opened it with deliberate care, sliding several documents across the table toward the center where everyone could see. The sound of paper moving broke the stillness like a signal. Richard Vaughn did not sit. He remained standing, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the documents quickly as if trying to get ahead of what was coming. "These are internal reports," he said, sharply, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "We already addressed these discrepancies." Olivia lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in her tone, not louder, not harsher, but undeniably firmer. "No, you concealed them," she replied. The distinction landed harder than any raised voice could have. A few executives shifted in their seats, their confidence unraveling as they looked down at the documents in front of them. Highlighted lines traced patterns of transactions approvals that should not have passed accounts that have been quietly adjusted to avoid detection. Olivia continued without pause. For the past several months, funds have been redirected through a series of layered approvals designed to appear routine. But when viewed together, the pattern becomes clear. She tapped one page lightly. This is not mismanagement. This is intentional. Victoria Hayes leaned forward, her composure tightening as she tried to interrupt. You cannot make accusations without understanding the full context. Olivia did not look away from the table. I understand the context completely, she said, and I also understand the intent. The room shifted again, this time, not with confusion, but with growing unease. One by one, executives began to recognize their own signatures, their own approvals, their own involvement, whether active or passive, in something they had not questioned deeply enough. Richard placed his hands on the table, leaning forward, his voice lower, now more controlled, but edged with urgency. You're drawing conclusions based on incomplete information. Olivia finally leaned back slightly, her eyes lifting to meet his again. Then allow me to complete the picture, she replied. She reached toward the screen embedded in the wall, and with a simple gesture activated it. The display came to life, instantly revealing a structured network of transactions visualized in a way that left no room for interpretation. Lines connected accounts, movements traced back to origin points, and at the center of it all the same name appeared repeatedly. Richard Vaughn. The impact was immediate. The room went still again, but this time it was not shock, it was exposure. Victoria turned her head slowly toward Richard, her expression shifting from defense to something closer to realization. Richard did not speak at first, his jaw tightening as he stared at the screen. This is a misrepresentation, he said finally, but the conviction behind his words had weakened. Olivia held his gaze steadily. It is a record, she corrected. Every action documented, every approval traced, every outcome verified. She paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle fully into the room. You believed no one would connect the pieces, she continued. You relied on complexity to hide simplicity. But complexity only delays the truth. It does not erase it. A quiet voice from the far end of the table spoke up, hesitant. Uncertain, what happens now? Olivia turned toward the speaker, her expression softening slightly, not with sympathy, but with resolution. Now we correct what has been allowed to continue, she answered. Her voice returned to its steady, controlled tone. Accountability begins here. She looked around the table, once more meeting each gaze deliberately. This is no longer a discussion about possibility. It is a matter of consequence. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one questioned her authority because the truth she had placed in front of them had already answered every doubt. The room remained frozen for a long moment after Olivia Bennett finished speaking, the weight of her words pressing down on every person seated at the table. But tension does not disappear, it transforms. And in that transformation, resistance begins to surface. Richard Vaughn straightened slowly, his expression tightening as he forced himself back into control. You are making a mistake if you think you can dismantle leadership based on selective data, he said, his voice measured but edged with defiance. This company does not operate on isolated interpretations. It operates on structure and authority. Olivia watched him without interruption, her gaze steady, as if she had expected this exact response. Authority does not exist without accountability, she replied calmly. And structure does not excuse misconduct. Richard took a step forward, placing both hands firmly on the table as he leaned in slightly. What you're doing right now is destabilizing the company, he said. Employees rely on consistency, not sudden accusations. If this information is handled incorrectly, it could create unnecessary panic. Several executives nodded subtly at his words, grasping onto the familiarity of his tone as if it offered some form of stability. Olivia allowed the silence to stretch for a second before responding. The company was destabilized long before I walked into this room, she said. You're only noticing it now because it is no longer hidden. Victoria Hayes shifted in her seat, her eyes moving quickly between Olivia and Richard, as if calculating which side held more weight. This approach could damage investor confidence, she added, carefully choosing her words. There are processes for handling internal concerns. Olivia turned her attention toward her expression unchanged. Those processes were used to conceal this, she replied. Her tone remained even but carried a finality that left little room for argument. Another executive spoke up from across the table, his voice uncertain but urgent. What if this is contained quietly? We can correct the issue internally without exposing it further. The suggestion hung in the air, fragile but tempting. Olivia leaned back, slightly, her hands folding together as she considered him for a moment. Contained quietly, she repeated. And how many times has that already been done? The man did not answer because the answer was already evident. Olivia continued, her voice steady, but now carrying a sharper clarity. Silence protects the problem, not the people affected by it. A subtle shift moved through the room again as doubt began to replace defense. Richard exhaled slowly, his patience thinning as control slipped further from his grasp. You are overstepping, he said more firmly now. Decisions at this level require coordination with the board. Olivia met his gaze directly without hesitation. I am the board, she replied. The statement landed with absolute certainty, leaving no space for interpretation. A quiet ripple moved through the room as the final layer of resistance began to fracture. Richard looked at her for a long second, searching for weakness, for uncertainty, for anything he could use. But there was nothing there. Only composure, only clarity, only authority that did not need to be proven. He straightened slightly, pulling his hands back from the table. Even if what you are presenting has merit, he said, choosing his words more carefully now. There are legal implications that must be considered before any action is taken. Olivia nodded, once acknowledging the statement. And they have been, she answered. Every detail has been reviewed, verified, and documented. She gestured lightly toward the screen, still displaying the structured network of evidence. This information has already been shared with external auditors and legal counsel. The impact was immediate, the last sense of control drained. From Richard's expression as realization set in, this was no longer a situation he could manage from within the room. This had moved beyond him, beyond influence, beyond negotiation. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not uncertainty, it was consequence taking shape. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her gaze moving across the table once more. This is not about removing leadership, she said quietly. It is about restoring integrity. She paused just long enough to let the words settle fully into the room. Effective immediately, all individuals directly involved in these actions will be placed under formal investigation, pending further review. The statement was delivered without hesitation, without emotion, but its impact was undeniable. Chairs shifted, breaths held, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one attempted to interrupt her. Because the outcome was no longer something they could argue against. It was something they would have to face. The meeting did not end with noise or argument. It ended with a silence that carried consequence far beyond the walls of the room. One by one, the executives who had once filled the space with certainty now sat still, their expressions stripped of confidence as reality settled into place. Olivia Bennett remained seated at the head of the table, her posture composed, her presence steady, as if nothing about this moment required effort, because for her it did not. She had already done the work long before anyone else understood what was happening. Richard Vaughn stood, unmoving for a moment, longer, his gaze fixed on the screen, as if staring long enough might change what it showed. But the evidence did not shift, and neither did the truth. Finally, he stepped back slowly, the weight of control slipping from him in a way he could not recover. Victoria Hayes lowered her eyes to the table, her earlier sharpness replaced with quiet calculation, but even she could not find a path forward that avoided what had already begun. Olivia broke the silence with calm precision. This meeting is concluded, she said, her voice even but final. Further communication will be directed through official channels. No one questioned her, no one objected, because there was nothing left to argue. Chairs moved softly as people began to stand, the sound subdued, almost hesitant, as if each movement carried more meaning than before. One by one, they filed out of the room, not with the confidence they had entered with, but with the awareness that everything had changed. Olivia remained seated for a moment, longer, watching the room, empty, not out of satisfaction, but out of understanding. This was not the end of something simple. It was the beginning of accountability that would reach far beyond this table. When the last person stepped out, she rose from her seat and walked toward the window overlooking the city. The view stretched wide beneath a sky that had begun to clear the light stronger now than it had been earlier in the day. She stood there for a moment, her reflection merging with the skyline beyond the glass. No longer divided between roles, no longer hidden behind perception. Just herself aligned fully with the position she held. A soft knock broke the stillness, and Olivia turned slightly as the door opened just enough for Ethan Cole to step inside. He paused near the entrance, clearly unsure if he should be there, but unable to ignore the moment he had just witnessed from outside. "I did not know," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. Olivia met his gaze, her expression calm, but no longer distant. "You were not supposed to," she said simply. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, as he shook his head slightly. "I guess that makes sense," he replied. There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if both understood the shift that had taken place, even if they had experienced it from different sides. Ethan glanced toward the table, then back at her. "Everything is going to change now," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Olivia nodded once. "It already has," she answered, her tone steady, but grounded in certainty. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod of his own. "For what it is worth," he added, "you handled that better than anyone I have ever seen." Olivia allowed a faint smile to appear, not for the praise, but for the sincerity behind it. "Thank you," she said. Ethan stepped back toward the door, understanding that his presence was no longer necessary, but before he left he paused once more. "You know, I meant what I said before, if you ever need anything." Olivia held his gaze for a brief second. "I know," she replied, and that was enough. Ethan nodded and stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving Olivia alone once more in the space that now fully belonged to her. She turned back toward the window, the city stretching endlessly ahead, and for the first time since she had walked into this building, as someone no one noticed, there was no divide between who she was and what she represented. There was only direction, and this time it was hers to define. The following days did not bring chaos as many had expected, but something far more unsettling to those who had once held control. Order, precise and deliberate. Olivia Bennett moved through the company no longer as a presence overlooked, but as a force that reshaped every space she entered. The investigation she initiated expanded quickly, not through public spectacle, but through structured action. External auditors arrived quietly, their presence known only to those directly involved, while internal systems were reviewed with a level of scrutiny the company had never experienced before. Offices that once carried authority now felt uncertain. Conversations that once dismissed concerns now carried caution. Olivia stood in her new office overlooking the city, the same skyline she had seen from below, now framed by floor-to-ceiling glass. Her desk was clear except for a single folder and the same thin device she had carried from the beginning. She did not fill the space with unnecessary symbols of power, because power for her was never about appearance, it was about direction. A soft knock came at the door, and her assistant stepped in with a composed expression. "The preliminary reports are ready," she said, placing a document on the desk. Olivia nodded once and opened the file, her eyes scanning the information with quiet focus. Confirmation layered over confirmation, every detail aligning with what she had already uncovered. The actions taken were not isolated, they were systematic, deliberate, and now fully exposed. She closed the folder slowly and looked up. "Proceed with formal actions," she said, her voice calm, but final. No hesitation, no uncertainty, because this was no longer a question of what to do. It was a matter of doing it correctly. Outside her office, the company continued to shift teams, reorganized roles, reassigned individuals who had once moved with unchecked authority now found themselves under review. But not everyone was affected in the same way. Those who had worked quietly, those who had followed process, those who had acted with integrity began to stand out in ways they never had before. Olivia understood that change was not only about removing what was wrong, it was about reinforcing what was right. Later that afternoon, she stepped out of her office and walked through the same corridor she had once cleaned. The difference now was not in the building, but in how people responded to her presence. Conversations paused not out of dismissal, but out of awareness. Eyes followed her not with judgment, but with recognition. Yet Olivia's expression remained unchanged, because respect that appears only when power is visible is not the kind she values. As she turned into a familiar hallway, she saw Ethan Cole standing near a workstation reviewing a set of reports. His posture focused, his attention steady. He looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment, there was a trace of the same hesitation from before, but it was quickly replaced with something more grounded, confidence built on understanding rather than assumption. Olivia stopped beside him, her gaze moving to the reports in his hands. "You have been working on a system log," she said. Ethan nodded slightly. "Trying to trace access patterns from the last few months," he replied. Olivia reached forward and adjusted one of the pages, pointing to a section he had nearly identified. "Start here," she said quietly. "The pattern repeats, but it shifts timing." Ethan followed her indication, his eyes sharpening as he saw it more clearly now. "I missed it," he admitted. Olivia shook her head slightly. "You were close," she replied. "The distinction mattered because effort and intention are not the same as failure." Ethan looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said. Olivia met his gaze briefly. "Your work matters," she said simply, and that was something he had not heard often in a place that valued results over people. As she stepped away, continuing down the corridor, the shift within the company became more visible, not through announcements, but through behavior. Accountability had begun to take root not as fear, but as structure. By the end of the week, the actions would be complete, roles would be redefined, and the company would stand on a foundation that no longer relied on silence to survive. And as Olivia Bennett moved forward through the space she once navigated unseen, it was clear that this was not just a correction, it was a transformation that would outlast every title, every position, and every assumption that had once defined the people within it. Weeks passed, and the company no longer resembled the place it had once been. The shift was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. In every hallway, every meeting, every decision that was now made with clarity instead of concealment. Olivia Bennett stood once again in the boardroom, but this time the atmosphere was different. The same glass walls, the same polished table, yet the energy had changed from tension to focus. The seats once occupied by arrogance were now filled with individuals chosen not for their titles, but for their integrity. The final reports had been completed, and the outcome was clear. Richard Vaughn and those directly involved in the financial misconduct were no longer part of the company. The investigation had moved beyond internal correction and into formal legal resolution. Accountability had not been avoided, it had been carried through to its full conclusion. Olivia looked around the table, her gaze steady as she spoke. "This company will not be defined by what happened here," she said calmly. "It will be defined by what we chose to do when we discovered it." Her words were not meant to inspire, they were meant to establish direction. And for the first time, the people in the room understood that leadership was not about control, it was about responsibility. The meeting concluded without unnecessary discussion, because clarity does not require excess. As the room slowly emptied, Olivia remained for a moment longer, her eyes moving across the space that had once been filled with voices that dismissed her. The memory was still there, but it no longer carried weight. It had served its purpose. She turned and walked out into the hallway, her steps unhurried, her presence grounded in something far more stable than authority. As she moved through the building, employees no longer looked past her, they acknowledged her not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And yet Olivia's expression remained unchanged, because she had never sought validation from perception. She reached the main lobby and paused briefly near the entrance, the same place she had walked through countless times without notice. The reflection in the glass doors showed a different image now, but the person behind it had never changed. Outside, the city moved with the same steady rhythm, people unaware of the transformation that had taken place inside the building behind her. Olivia stepped forward and exited into the open air, the cool breeze, carrying a sense of finality, not of an ending, but of completion. A voice called her name from behind, and she turned to see Ethan Cole. Approaching, his pace slightly hurried, but his expression clear. He stopped a few feet away, catching his breath before speaking. "I just wanted to say something before you left," he said. Olivia waited her attention fully on him. Ethan straightened slightly, then continued. "When you were working here before all of this, you treated people the same way you do now, like they mattered." He paused briefly, as if choosing his words carefully. Most people only act that way when they have power, but you did it when no one was watching. Olivia held his gaze for a moment, the sincerity in his words unmistakable. That is when it matters most, she replied quietly. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding, settling into his expression. I'm glad you're the one in charge, he said simply. Olivia allowed a faint smile to appear not as a reaction, but as an acknowledgement. Then she turned back toward the city, her path already set ahead of her, because in the position had never defined her actions. Her actions had defined the position, and that was something no title could ever replace.